You underestimated me. These contracts are null and void.
You're right. She's right. No, this is a mistake.
You should never humiliate someone holding your future in their hands. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but 30 seconds from now, they would haunt Edward Sinclair for the rest of his life. Hey, coffee. The sharp snap of fingers cracked across the rooftop terrace high above Manhattan, louder than the jazz trio playing near the glass railing. Conversations softened. A few wealthy investors glanced over their wine glasses with amused smiles. Edward Sinclair didn't even look up when he snapped his fingers the second time. "Miss, are you deaf?" Naomi Carter turned slowly from the service station, balancing a silver tray lined with crystal cups and steaming espresso. Her black uniform was spotless, pressed so neatly it almost looked severe under the amber rooftop lights. Around her, the warm June wind carried the scent of expensive cigars, rain on concrete, and grilled filet mignon from the private chef station near the terrace doors. She walked toward Edward's table calmly, her low heels barely making a sound against the polished stone floor. "Your coffee, sir," she said softly. Edward finally looked at her, but only briefly, the same way someone notices a valet or an elevator button. Nothing more. "About time." One of the men beside him laughed into his bourbon glass. These hotel girls move slower every year. Quiet chuckles circled the table. Naomi lowered the cup carefully beside Edward's hand. The billion-dollar merger documents spread across the table fluttered slightly in the rooftop wind, pages clipped together beneath a silver Montblanc pen. Numbers, debt structures, equity ratios, legal clauses buried beneath polished language. Naomi's eyes shifted instinctively. Just one glance, then another. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray. Edward noticed her pause. "Something wrong?" he asked coldly. Naomi looked away immediately. "No, sir." But her heartbeat had already changed. Fast now. Uneven. Because buried halfway down page 47 was a clause she recognized instantly. Not from serving tables. From another life. The rooftop lights reflected faintly in her eyes as she stared at the line again. Debt conversion trigger upon secondary liquidity event. Her stomach tightened. She knew exactly what that meant. Across the table, Victor Hale continued speaking smoothly to the investors. "This structure protects Sinclair Capital from future dilution while maximizing flexibility during expansion." Naomi almost moved away. Almost. The old version of herself screamed to stay quiet. Waitresses did not interrupt billionaires. Especially black waitresses serving powerful white men who already saw them as invisible background noise. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 years buried in financial models and risk assessments under fluorescent Wall Street lights, wouldn't let her move. Edward lifted his espresso cup without looking at her again. "You can go now." Naomi swallowed once. Hard. Around her, the city glittered endlessly beneath the rooftop skyline. Black cars crawled through Manhattan traffic 27 floors below. Helicopter lights blinked slowly over the Hudson River. Everything looked powerful up here. Untouchable. But all Naomi could see was the contract, and the trap hidden inside it. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "Sir." The entire table paused. Edward looked up slowly, irritation flashing across his face. Naomi's pulse hammered in her throat. "If you sign that agreement tonight," she said carefully, "you lose controlling interest in your company within 6 months." Silence crashed over the rooftop. Even the jazz music suddenly felt far away. Victor Hale stopped breathing for half a second. Edward stared at her, then laughed once, short and sharp. "And a waitress understands private equity now." A few investors smirked. Someone muttered, "This should be good." But Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the contract. "Not a waitress," she said quietly. "The analyst who built the risk model your company still uses today." The wind sweeping across the rooftop suddenly felt colder. Nobody touched their drinks. Nobody smiled now. Edward Sinclair sat motionless at the center of the long marble table, his espresso cup frozen halfway to his mouth as the city lights flickered behind him like distant sparks. Naomi Carter stood beside the table holding her silver tray so tightly her fingertips had gone pale beneath the rooftop lights. Victor Hale recovered first. Men like him always did. His polished smile returned slowly, though the muscle in his jaw twitched once before settling. "Interesting claim," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. especially from someone serving cocktails 10 minutes ago. A few nervous laughs followed, weaker this time. Edward finally lowered the cup onto its saucer with a soft click. "You built our risk model?" he asked. His tone was flat now. "Careful." Naomi nodded once. 6 years ago, before Sinclair Capital outsourced the revisions. Victor's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. "That is impossible," he said. "The original architecture came from Easton Analytics." Naomi looked directly at him for the first time. Calm. Unshaken. "No," she said quietly. "Easton purchased it after my division was dissolved." The rooftop fell silent again. Somewhere near the bar, ice cracked inside a crystal shaker. Edward stared at her harder now, searching her face as if trying to pull a memory from deep underwater. Naomi could see it happening in real time. Recognition. Faint at first, then growing. She had changed since those Wall Street years. Back then she wore tailored blazers, carried 3 phones, and survived on black coffee and 4 hours of sleep. Now her hair was tied neatly behind her neck, and her name tag sat against a pressed hotel uniform beneath the rooftop lights. But her eyes had not changed. Edward leaned forward slowly. "Naomi Carter," he said at last. Victor's expression tightened immediately. Naomi gave a small nod. One of the younger investors blinked in surprise. "Wait," he muttered. "The Naomi Carter?" Another executive turned quickly. "You are the analyst from the Mercer collapse report." Naomi did not answer immediately. Her silence answered for her. Edward leaned back in his chair slowly, his face unreadable now. The rooftop music continued somewhere behind them, soft piano floating awkwardly through the tension gathering over the table. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes locked onto her at once. Most of them no longer saw a waitress. They saw a ghost from the financial world standing beside a tray of untouched champagne. Victor laughed softly, but there was strain beneath it now. "Even if that were true," he said, "it changes nothing. The agreement has been reviewed by attorneys from 3 firms. Naomi looked at the contract again. Then none of them checked the debt conversion language after the secondary liquidity trigger. Edward's eyes dropped immediately toward page 47. Fast now. Focused. Naomi watched the exact moment he found the clause. His face did not move at first. Then the color drained slowly from his cheeks. One investor leaned across the table. "What is it?" Edward did not answer. Victor spoke instead, too quickly. "It is standard dilution protection." "No," Naomi interrupted softly. "It transfers voting control after the debt converts." Edward looked up sharply. Naomi continued before fear could stop her. "Once the secondary capital event activates, Sinclair Capital falls below controlling ownership. The board loses majority authority within 6 months." The words settled heavily into the rooftop air. Nobody laughed now. Edward flipped another page. Then another. His breathing slowed. Dangerous now. Controlled in the way powerful men become when they realize they were almost humiliated in front of the entire world. Victor's hand moved toward the contract. Edward stopped him instantly with one look. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Naomi felt the tension spread across the rooftop like a storm rolling over dark water. Then Edward asked the question nobody else dared to ask. "How did you catch it in under 30 seconds?" Naomi swallowed once. Her voice came out low and steady. "Because I wrote the original protections myself, and somebody rewrote them to bury the theft." The silence around the rooftop table no longer felt elegant. It felt dangerous, heavy, the kind of silence powerful people fall into when they realize somebody lower in the room understands more than they do. Edward Sinclair kept staring at page 47, one hand resting against the contract while the city wind tugged softly at the edges of the paper. Across from him, Victor Hale forced another smile, but it sat awkwardly on his face now, stretched too tight beneath the rooftop lights. "Edward," Victor said carefully, "you are seriously going to let a hotel employee derail a $1.4 billion agreement?" Naomi remained still beside the table, tray balanced against her hip, but inside her chest her heartbeat pounded hard enough to hurt. She knew exactly how these rooms worked. She used to survive inside them. People with money rarely feared being wrong. They feared looking foolish in front of other wealthy people. Edward finally lifted his eyes from the contract. "Sit down, Victor." The words came quiet, flat, but the temperature of the rooftop changed instantly. Victor hesitated for half a second before lowering himself slowly into the leather chair again. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. One of the investors loosened his tie. Another reached silently for the contract copy in front of him and began flipping pages faster now. Naomi watched the realization spread around the table, one face at a time. Confusion first, then concern, then fear. Edward looked back toward Naomi. Really looked at her now. "You disappeared," he said suddenly. The question caught several people off guard. Naomi swallowed once before answering. "Life happened." Edward leaned back slowly, studying her with an intensity that made the rooftop lights feel sharper against her skin. "No," he said quietly. "One day, every bank in Manhattan was quoting your projections. Then suddenly you were gone." Naomi said nothing. The wind swept across the rooftop again, colder now, rattling the candle flames inside their glass holders. Somewhere below, a police siren echoed faintly through the city streets 27 floors down. Victor shifted impatiently. "This is becoming ridiculous." Edward ignored him completely. "Why did you leave?" Naomi's fingers tightened around the silver tray. For a second, she considered lying. Something simple. Something easy. But exhaustion settled over her too heavily for that tonight. "My younger brother was killed during a robbery in Queens," she said softly. "My mother stopped eating after the funeral. I stayed home to take care of her." The rooftop fell still again. Even Victor stopped moving. Naomi kept her eyes on the skyline instead of the table. After a while, she continued quietly, "Wall Street moved on without me." Edward's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Naomi could see memory moving behind his eyes now. Meetings, trading floors, financial conferences. He remembered her. Worse than that, he remembered overlooking her. One of the older investors suddenly frowned at the contract. "Wait a minute," he muttered. "This conversion clause activates after secondary debt restructuring." Another executive looked up sharply. "Which means the board loses majority voting rights." Victor sat forward immediately. "That is not the intention of the agreement." "No," Naomi said calmly. "It is exactly the intention." Edward's eyes shifted slowly toward Victor now. Dangerous again. Controlled. "You told me this deal protected Sinclair Capital." Victor forced a laugh that sounded thin in the night air. "It does protect Sinclair." Naomi shook her head once. "No. It transfers ownership quietly enough that shareholders will not notice until the next liquidity event." One investor cursed under his breath. Another immediately pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. Edward remained perfectly still for several long seconds. Then he closed the contract carefully. Too carefully. Naomi recognized that movement too. The calm before powerful men make decisions that ruin careers. Victor saw it too. Sweat glistened faintly along his temple beneath the rooftop lights. "Edward," he began carefully, "you cannot seriously trust her over your own legal team." Edward never looked away from Victor when he answered. "Right now," he said quietly, "she is the only person at this table who actually protected my company tonight." Victor Hale's confidence finally cracked at exactly 10:42 p.m. It happened quietly. No shouting. No dramatic movement. Just a thin line of sweat sliding past his temple beneath the rooftop lights while three different investors reread the same paragraph in stunned silence. The Manhattan skyline shimmered behind them through the warm summer haze, but nobody admired the view anymore. Every eye kept returning to the contract sitting in front of Edward Sinclair like a loaded weapon nobody wanted to touch. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the table, tray still balanced carefully against her side, though her arms had started aching from holding it so long. A waiter near the rooftop entrance glanced toward her nervously, silently asking if she needed help. Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not now." Edward leaned forward slowly, elbows resting against the marble table as he stared down at the agreement again. "How much?" he asked quietly. Victor blinked. "Excuse me." Edward looked up. Cold now. "How much would Sinclair Capital have lost?" Victor opened his mouth carefully. "Edward, these numbers are theoretical until conversion activates." Naomi answered before he could continue. "Control of the company within 6 months. Possibly sooner if the debt triggers early." One investor swore softly under his breath. Another removed his glasses and rubbed both hands over his face. Edward's jaw tightened. "Dollar amount." Naomi exhaled once. "Roughly 800 million in diluted control during phase 1. Silence. Thick and immediate. Even the rooftop musicians had stopped playing now, sensing the tension spreading across the terrace like smoke. Victor sat straighter. That estimate is exaggerated. Naomi finally set the silver tray down on an empty section of the table. Carefully, deliberately. Then she reached for the contract. Several people stared in surprise as the black waitress in a hotel uniform calmly flipped through pages worth more than most neighborhoods in America. Naomi stopped at another clause near the back. "No," she said softly. "This part is worse." Edward's eyes narrowed. Naomi tapped a line halfway down the page. The offshore debt vehicle redirects liability through a secondary holding company. One investor frowned immediately. "Wait." Another executive leaned closer. "That means the shareholders absorb the collapse." Naomi nodded once. "And Sinclair becomes legally responsible for the restructuring failure." Victor finally lost patience. "Enough." His voice cracked sharply across the rooftop. "You are completely out of your depth." Naomi looked at him calmly. "Am I?" Victor stood abruptly now, chair scraping against stone. "Edward, this woman has been out of the industry for years. She works room service at a midtown hotel. You cannot seriously let her sabotage this agreement because she remembers a few financial terms from a decade ago." The insult hung in the air for a second too long. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Not hurt, just tired. She had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. Smart for a black woman. Impressive for someone from Queens. Good enough until richer people entered the room. Edward noticed her expression shift. Something about it unsettled him more than the numbers inside the contract. He remembered those years now. Naomi had been brilliant. Everyone knew it. But brilliance alone had never guaranteed survival in rooms like these. Especially not for someone who looked like her. Victor pointed toward Naomi sharply. "You know what this really is?" he snapped. "Bitterness." She disappeared from finance, and now she wants relevance again. Naomi's face remained still, but Edward suddenly looked furious. Not explosive fury. Worse, controlled fury. The kind that arrived slowly behind expensive suits and measured breathing. "Sit down, Victor." Victor hesitated. Edward's voice dropped lower. "Now." The rooftop went completely still again. Victor slowly lowered himself back into his chair, but the confidence was gone now. Edward turned toward Naomi. "Why did nobody else catch this?" Naomi looked down at the contract one last time before answering. "Because the trap was written by someone who understood exactly how arrogant powerful men can become when they think nobody beneath them is smart enough to question them." Edward stared at her in silence while the city lights flickered behind her shoulders like distant fire. For several long seconds, nobody at the rooftop table moved. The city stretched endlessly around them in rivers of white headlights and glowing office towers. But the world inside that private terrace had narrowed to one contract, one billionaire, and one black woman standing quietly beneath the amber lights with tired eyes and a hotel name tag pinned to her chest. Edward Sinclair slowly reached for his phone. The motion alone made Victor Hale sit straighter. "Edward," Victor said carefully, "let us handle this privately." Edward ignored him completely. He pressed a single number and lifted the phone to his ear without breaking eye contact with the contract. "Call legal," he said quietly. "Now." One of the investors shifted uncomfortably. Another quietly closed his tablet. Across the terrace, waitstaff had stopped pretending not to watch. Naomi could feel their eyes from near the service station. Shock, curiosity, pride, fear. The same mix she had seen her entire life whenever someone like her stopped acting invisible. Edward ended the call and looked toward Naomi again. "You said somebody rewrote the protections intentionally." Naomi nodded once. "Yes." "How certain are you?" Naomi glanced down at the contract again. "Certain enough that I would have walked away from the table immediately." Victor laughed softly, but it sounded desperate now. "You are basing all this on assumptions." Naomi looked at him calmly. "No, I am basing it on pattern recognition." Victor opened his mouth again, but Edward cut him off sharply. "Enough." The single word landed like a locked door. Victor leaned back slowly, his face hardening beneath the rooftop lights. Naomi noticed something then. Not fear exactly. Anger. Not because the deal had collapsed. Because someone beneath him had exposed it first. Men like Victor could survive losing money. What they could not survive was humiliation. Edward stood slowly from the table. Every investor immediately fell silent again. The skyline reflected across the glass railing behind him while warm wind moved through his gray suit jacket. He looked older standing now. Heavier somehow. "You all knew Naomi Carter once worked for Sinclair Analytics?" He asked the table. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one executive cleared his throat. We knew the name. Edward nodded slowly. She built the forecasting system that carried us through the Mercer recovery. Another investor frowned. Then why was she never promoted? The question landed harder than expected. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. Victor looked away first. Edward did not answer immediately. The silence itself became the answer. One of the older board members exhaled quietly through his nose. Jesus Christ. Edward turned toward Naomi fully now. You said Wall Street moved on without you. Naomi folded her hands lightly in front of her. Wall Street moves on from everyone eventually. Edward shook his head once. Not from talent like yours. Naomi almost smiled at that. Almost. But there was too much exhaustion sitting inside her bones tonight. Talent is not always enough, she said softly. Not for everyone. The words settled heavily between them. Edward understood exactly what she meant. So did every person sitting at that table. The rooftop suddenly felt colder despite the summer heat. Somewhere behind the bar, a wine glass slipped from nervous fingers and shattered faintly in the distance. Nobody turned toward the sound. Victor finally stood again, slower this time. Edward, he said carefully, we can still salvage this agreement. Edward looked at him with complete stillness. Salvage. Victor nodded quickly. We revised the language. Quietly. Nobody outside this rooftop ever needs to know there was an issue. Naomi watched Edward's expression change at those words. Not anger now. Disappointment. Deep and personal. Edward stepped toward Victor slowly. You still think this is about public embarrassment? Victor hesitated. Edward's voice dropped lower. You tried to steal my company while drinking $1,200 bourbon at my table. Nobody breathed. Victor forced another tight smile. That is an extreme interpretation. Edward looked toward the contract one final time. Then toward Naomi. No, he said quietly. The extreme part is that the only person in this city honest enough to stop it tonight was the woman I snapped my fingers at like she did not matter. The rooftop dinner ended without dessert. One by one, the investors gathered their phones and contracts in uneasy silence, avoiding eye contact as they drifted toward the elevators beneath the soft gold lights of the terrace. Nobody shook Victor Hale's hand on the way out. Nobody thanked him for the evening. The city beyond the glass railing still glittered like a living ocean, taxis threading through midnight traffic far below, but the energy of the rooftop had changed completely. The arrogance was gone now. Only tension remained. Naomi Carter stood alone near the service station beside a tray of untouched champagne flutes, finally letting herself exhale for the first time in nearly an hour. Her shoulders ached. Her feet burned inside black work shoes she had worn through double shifts all week. She could still feel the weight of every stare that had followed her across the terrace after Edward Sinclair spoke those words aloud. The woman I snapped my fingers at like she did not matter. A warm wind rolled through the rooftop, carrying the distant scent of rain and exhaust from the streets below. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Just 1 second. Long enough to steady herself. You should have charged them consulting fees. The voice came softly from beside her. Naomi opened her eyes and found an older bartender polishing a crystal glass with a white cloth. Miguel, 63 years old, worked the rooftop bar every Friday night. He smiled gently without looking up. Naomi let out the smallest laugh. Pretty sure I almost got fired instead. Miguel shrugged lightly. Maybe, but I watched every face at that table tonight. He finally looked toward her. Half those men came in here believing they owned the world. He nodded toward the elevator lobby. They left looking scared. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. The lights above reflected softly against the polished surface beneath her feet. She remembered another floor once. 33rd story. Midtown Manhattan. Endless rows of glass offices and glowing monitors. Back when people listened the moment she entered a room. Back before grief hollowed her life out slowly from the inside. Miguel leaned against the bar quietly. You miss it? Naomi stared toward the skyline for several seconds before answering. Sometimes. Then why stay here? Naomi folded a linen napkin carefully between her hands. Because this place does not ask me to pretend I am stronger than I am. Miguel nodded like he understood more than she said aloud. Behind them, staff members quietly reset tables abandoned mid-meal. Candle flames flickered softly in the summer wind, while silverware clicked faintly against white plates. Normal sounds. Small sounds. the kind that return after something enormous passes through a room. Naomi reached for the tray again. I should finish cleanup. No, Edward Sinclair's voice stopped her instantly. Naomi turned slowly. He stood alone near the center of the rooftop now, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened slightly beneath the city lights. Without the investors around him, he looked different somehow. Less polished, more tired. Victor Hale was gone. So were the lawyers. Only Edward remained. Naomi straightened automatically. Sir. Edward glanced toward the tray in her hands, then toward the rooftop exit where the last elevator doors had already closed. You can stop calling me that. Naomi did not answer. Edward walked closer slowly, hands resting loosely in his pockets while warm wind moved through the edges of his gray suit jacket. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt hostile now, just heavy. Edward finally looked directly at her. Do you know what bothered me most tonight? Naomi waited quietly. Edward exhaled through his nose. It was not the contract. He shook his head once. It was realizing you stood beside that table for 20 minutes before I ever bothered looking at your face. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest unexpectedly. Not anger. Something sadder than that. Edward stared out across Manhattan again, the lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. I spent years building companies, he said quietly. And somewhere along the way I started seeing people as categories instead of human beings. Naomi lowered her gaze toward the tray again. Edward looked back at her slowly. And tonight the smartest person on that rooftop was the one carrying everybody's drinks. Naomi looked down at the silver tray in her hands because it suddenly felt easier than looking directly at Edward Sinclair. The rooftop had nearly emptied now. Staff moved quietly between tables collecting untouched desserts and half-full wine glasses, while the Manhattan skyline glowed beyond the terrace like scattered gold beneath the midnight sky. Somewhere below, traffic hummed endlessly through the city streets, distant and soft like ocean waves. Edward stepped closer to the marble table and rested one hand against the abandoned contract. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Naomi gave a small tired smile, without humor. Most people only apologize after they need something. Edward absorbed that in silence. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of rain through the rooftop air. Naomi finally looked up at him fully. You know what the strange part is? She asked softly. Edward waited. Tonight was not even the first time you dismissed me without seeing me. Edward's expression tightened slightly. Naomi walked slowly toward the edge of the rooftop, heels clicking softly against stone. Edward followed a few steps behind her. The city stretched endlessly below them, glass towers glowing beneath drifting clouds, while helicopters blinked red across the dark sky over the Hudson River. Naomi folded her arms lightly against the wind. 7 years ago, she said quietly, you visited our analytics division after the Mercer recovery. Edward frowned slightly, searching his memory. Then his face changed. Recognition again. Clearer this time. Naomi continued before he could speak. I presented the revised projections personally. Edward stared at her. The conference room with the blue glass walls. Naomi nodded once. You remember. Edward exhaled slowly through his nose. You were the youngest analyst there. Naomi looked back toward the skyline. I was also the only black woman in the room. Edward said nothing, because there was nothing to deny. Naomi's voice remained calm, but softer now, worn thin around the edges by old disappointment. After the meeting, one of your senior partners told me clients preferred hearing numbers from people who looked more established. Edward closed his eyes briefly. He remembered now, not the exact words. Worse than that, he remembered allowing them to happen. Naomi watched the reflection of city lights shimmer across the glass railing. 3 months later, Easton Analytics recruited me away. Edward shook his head slowly. I should have stopped that. Naomi looked at him gently. But you did not. The silence between them deepened. Not hostile anymore. Honest. Edward loosened his tie completely now, the polished billionaire image finally cracking beneath the weight of memory and regret. I spent years believing I was different from men like Victor Hale, he admitted quietly. Smarter. More ethical. Naomi studied him carefully beneath the rooftop lights. Edward laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor inside it. Turns out I just learned how to hide my prejudice behind better manners. The words settled heavily into the warm night air. Naomi looked away again because something about hearing him admit it so plainly made her chest ache unexpectedly. Not because she wanted revenge, because honesty that late in life always carried sadness with it. Edward stepped beside her at the railing, both of them staring silently across Manhattan for several seconds. Then Edward spoke again. "Do you know why I recognized your name tonight?" Naomi glanced toward him. Edward looked down at the contract resting on the table behind them. "Every quarter for 7 years," he said quietly. "My executives still reference the Carter model during risk reviews." Naomi blinked once in surprise. Edward nodded slowly. "Your work survived inside my company long after you disappeared from it." Naomi looked toward the skyline again, but her eyes had softened now. Edward continued carefully. "And tonight the woman everybody ignored walked into a rooftop full of millionaires and saved every one of us from disaster." Naomi let out a slow breath into the wind. "No," she said softly. "I just refused to stay silent while another powerful man underestimated me." Edward stared at her quietly beneath the city lights, and for the first time all night, he looked genuinely ashamed. The rooftop had grown almost completely quiet by midnight. Only the soft clink of silverware and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic drifted through the warm summer air now. Most of the staff had finished cleaning and disappeared downstairs, leaving only a few candle flames flickering against the marble tables beneath the skyline. Naomi Carter stood near the glass railing with her hands folded lightly in front of her, staring out across the city she once thought would belong to her someday. Behind her, Edward Sinclair remained motionless beside the abandoned contract. The billionaire who had entered the rooftop hours earlier full of confidence now looked like a man standing inside the ruins of his own pride. Naomi heard footsteps approach slowly across the stone floor. She turned as Edward stopped a few feet away from her. In his hand was a slim black business card holder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through Naomi's hair, while helicopters blinked far above the Hudson River like tiny red stars. Edward finally held out a card toward her. "Come back," he said quietly. Naomi looked down at the card but did not take it. "Sinclair Capital, Executive Strategy Division." Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Edward continued carefully. "Not a staff, not a support." His voice lowered slightly. "As partner-level leadership." Naomi let out a small breath through her nose. Almost a laugh, though sadness rested beneath it. "You are offering me a corner office because I saved your company tonight." Edward shook his head immediately. No, his eyes stayed on her steadily now. "I am offering you what should have been yours years ago." Naomi stared at the card for several long seconds without touching it. The city lights reflected softly against the glass railing behind her, casting gold patterns across the rooftop floor. "Do you know what happens to people like me in rooms like yours?" she asked softly. Edward answered honestly. "Yes." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Do you?" Edward nodded once. "You work twice as hard for half the trust." Naomi looked away toward the skyline again. Edward's voice remained calm behind her. "And every mistake gets remembered longer." Naomi swallowed quietly. The honesty in his voice made resisting harder than arrogance would have. Edward stepped closer, but not too close. "Careful now. Respectful. I cannot change what happened before," he said, "but I can stop pretending I did not benefit from it." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She thought about hospital bills stacked on her kitchen counter. Her mother asleep in a small apartment in Queens, believing her daughter still worked temporary hospitality jobs because the financial world had no place for women who looked like her after 30. She thought about every interview that ended the moment executives noticed the employment gap on her resume. Every smile that disappeared after they saw her skin before her credentials. Slowly, Naomi turned back toward Edward. "You know what the hardest part was after I left finance?" she asked quietly. Edward waited. It was not losing the money. Her fingers tightened slightly together. It was watching people stop listening the moment they saw the uniform instead of the mind wearing it. Edward lowered his eyes briefly. Naomi continued softly. "Tonight was not unusual for me." The words hit harder than anger would have. Edward looked back up at her with something close to grief in his expression now. "It should have been unusual," he said quietly. Naomi studied him for a long moment beneath the rooftop lights. Then finally, slowly, she took the business card from his hand. Edward exhaled softly, but Naomi lifted one finger before he could speak. "This is not forgiveness." Edward nodded immediately. "I know. Naomi glanced down at the card again. And if I ever walk back into your world, I do it as Naomi Carter. Not the woman carrying drinks while rich men talk over her. Edward's voice came low and steady. Agreed. For the first time all night, Naomi allowed the smallest real smile to touch her face. Not victory, not revenge, just dignity returning quietly to a place that once tried to erase it. By the time Naomi Carter stepped into the elevator, the rooftop behind her had gone completely still. The doors slid shut softly, muting the distant sounds of clinking glasses and quiet cleanup from the terrace above Manhattan. For the first time all night, she was finally alone. The mirrored elevator walls reflected the soft gold light overhead across her black uniform, across the loose strands of hair brushing her cheeks, across the exhaustion resting beneath her eyes. Naomi leaned back gently against the polished wall and closed her eyes for one slow breath. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders hurt. But something deeper inside her felt strangely lighter now, like a door she stopped knocking on years ago had finally opened on its own. The elevator descended silently through the hotel floors while Manhattan glowed outside the glass panels in rivers of white and gold. Naomi looked down at the business card still resting in her hand. Sinclair Capital, Executive Strategy Division. The letters shimmered faintly beneath the elevator lights. 7 years ago, she would have stared at a card like that with ambition burning through her chest. Tonight, she only felt quiet, tired, careful. The elevator doors opened into the nearly empty lobby just after midnight. Marble floors stretched beneath towering chandeliers, while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. A young valet glanced up from the front desk television and froze slightly when he recognized her. Not because of the uniform anymore, because news traveled fast among people who spent their lives unnoticed in expensive buildings. Naomi walked slowly across the lobby toward the exit, heels clicking softly against polished stone. Near the revolving doors, Miguel stood beside the concierge station, holding his old coffee thermos. He smiled the moment he saw her. "You survived." Naomi let out a quiet laugh. "Barely." Miguel noticed the business card in her hand immediately. His eyebrows lifted. "Well now." Naomi shook her head softly. "It is only a card." Miguel smiled knowingly. "Sometimes one card changes everything." Naomi looked toward the revolving glass doors where warm summer rain had finally begun falling outside, silver drops streaking across the city lights. "Maybe," she said quietly. Miguel studied her for a second before speaking again. "You know what I liked most tonight?" Naomi glanced toward him. The older bartender smiled gently. "You never once tried to embarrass anybody." Naomi looked down at the card again. "I know what humiliation feels like." Miguel nodded slowly. "Exactly." The words settled warmly inside her chest. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city while taxis sprayed rainwater across dark streets beneath glowing billboards and midnight traffic lights. Naomi thanked Miguel quietly and stepped toward the revolving doors. Behind her, the elevator chimed softly again. Naomi turned instinctively. Edward Sinclair stood across the lobby near the elevators, jacket folded over one arm now, tie completely removed. He did not call after her, did not rush toward her. He simply stood there watching silently as rain shimmered beyond the glass entrance behind her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Edward gave the smallest nod. Not the nod of a billionaire acknowledging hotel staff. The nod of one human being finally recognizing another. Naomi returned the gesture gently. Then she stepped outside into the warm Manhattan rain. The city air smelled like wet concrete, taxi exhaust, and summer heat rising from the streets after midnight. Naomi lifted her face slightly toward the rain as she walked down the sidewalk beneath the glowing hotel lights. Cars rolled past in blurred reflections while thunder echoed softly between skyscrapers overhead. In her hand, the business card remained dry beneath her fingers. Behind the glass lobby windows, Edward Sinclair still stood motionless watching her disappear into the city crowd. But this time, when people passed Naomi on the sidewalk, she no longer felt invisible. And somewhere high above Manhattan, inside a rooftop full of empty champagne glasses and abandoned contracts, the silence left behind no longer belonged to power. It belonged to truth.
It's right here on page 47. You plan to liquidate the pension fund the entire time.